been covering. Let me do that again. So just a quick introduction. My name is Esha Chabra. I'm a journalist and a writer. I've been covering the space of international development and sustainability and business for over 10 years now. It's my pleasure to talk with Gillian this morning, who is the Chief Climate Officer at USAID, among many other roles. So we're keen to have her for the next 45 minutes or so. We'll chat for about 30 minutes, and then we'll have some questions from the folks who are listening in as well. So Gillian, thank you so much for being here today. I appreciate it. I know you had a few technical hiccups getting here, but thank you for taking the time.
Yeah, no problem. Happy to be here.
You have had really an incredible background. I was kind of binging on some of your other podcasts and videos on the internet this weekend to get to know a little bit more about your career and your path. And you've been doing this since you were a teenager. So can you kind of start at the beginning? Because a lot of folks who are listening are, considering a job in the sort of green economy. Tell us a little bit about you as a 12-year-old, when I understand you started the chapter of Amnesty International at your school, and you were very keen on these topics early on.
Yeah, I did start when I was 12. That was because I think my history teachers recognized I was, thinking about broader social justice issues and introduced me to the ailing Amnesty International chapter at my high school. And I started running that and organized a school symposium on torture and got involved in a kind of the movement to stop nuclear war, which was a big thing in the 80s. More generally just started carving a path towards public service engagement on civil rights, human rights, and environmental issues at an early age. And I don't know where that come from beyond, the fact that the teachers recognize some potential there and some interest, because I have a brother who's a cloud computing specialist and another one who's a lobster fisherman. So there's, I don't know what genetics have to do with it.
And so at what point, though, did you decide that this was the career path you wanted to take? I mean, was this straight out of college that you dove into international development and activism and all of that?
Yeah, I mean, throughout college, I was doing a range of, what I would describe as sort of domestic civil rights work, like working at the Prison Legal Assistance Project when I was an undergrad, providing legal guidance to prisoners who needed support in various areas. Also working for the Overseas Development Institute, reviewing grant proposals for small grants that were being offered, engaging in, a range of protests and politically oriented action. So I was both trying to get an exposure to the issues at a local level, also working in a battered women's shelter, and kind of exposing myself to the global work. I spent a summer in Zimbabwe in 1986, where Mugabe had been, what was the leader and was sort of, ironically, at that point, like considered a big hope for Africa in terms of leadership. And I was doing some agricultural work and some teaching through a program there. So I was bouncing around between the domestic and the international, and, continued to do that throughout my career until more recently, when I've been very focused globally, I think since about 2015.
And so tell me a little bit about this, is your role as CEO at Global Witness. How did that come about? And I think that there's a connection there to climate change, although sometimes it might not be as clear of a connection when you think about natural resources and how they're sourced. It's a big part of the environmental discussion.
Yeah, so I was actually, I got connected to, I had known about Global Witness since the early days, and then they were founded, and I was especially interested because they were looking at the intersection between human rights and environmental abuses. And it was always my concern that environment is considered like a separate terrain and that we're not looking macroscopically at the problems. I think the climate crisis is as much a failure of kind of human development as it is a failure to preserve, our environmental resources. So anyway, I was always interested in that nexus and kind of breaking down those barriers between the terrain. So when they were founded, I, saw them, came onto the scene. And then, flash forward, we were at Sundance, which is a film institute, and I was hired to serve as like a sort of communications advisor to them at one point, and then they encouraged me to apply. So I moved to London, but when I did so to run that organization, the whole premise was that they were going to be moving more and more into climate oriented work. So they pioneered the so-called blood diamonds conversation, and they were looking at uh, trees and timber for a long time, which obviously is very climate related, but many of the critical minerals they were looking at were gemstones, which aren't as climate relevant as, other critical minerals like lithium that we need for batteries to power renewable energy. So
Mm,
the idea was to shift the organization towards a more prominent climate focus, which is where it stands today.
mm. And then that led you to USAID, which, from what I understand, you weren't necessarily looking for a job or a career in government, but it sort of just came about. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah, well, our administrator is a woman named Samantha Power, who I met back in the mid 90s when she was at Harvard running the Carr Center for Human Rights. So we had stayed in touch over the years, and she had had several prior forays into government. She was the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, and she worked in the National Security Council in the White House under Obama. So she was moving in and out of government, but I just sent her a message to congratulate her when the Senate confirmed her nomination. And she responded right away asking what we should do. And, we organized an early morning conversation to talk about it. And one thing led to another, but I didn't uh, sort of try to pave the way for a political appointment to work in government. That hadn't really been on my radar screen. And I just decided it was, too important an opportunity to pass up.
So, for those listeners who might not be familiar with the structure of USAID, I mean, how much work is focused on environmental issues, would you say, at USAID? Because USAID is known really for their development work, right?
Yeah, so USAID is the largest development agency, government development agency in the world. It's the Agency for International Development, and we have 10,000 staff and a presence in 80 countries worldwide. And our work is organized across a range of sectors. So we do work in global health, humanitarian assistance for, crisis response, for example, when earthquakes hit. We also do work in education and democracy, rights, and governance, in technology, economic development, agriculture and food security, and environment and biodiversity, and more. But the point of the USAID climate strategy, which I helped finalize and launch in Earth Day of 2022, that will take us through 2030, is to really make USAID a climate agency. So how because the climate crisis is affecting all aspects of our work, how can we really take it into account so that we're advancing good development, which must be in today's world, climate smart development? So I don't think of it again as an environmental work per se, right? I mean, we are talking about impacts. If you take carbon out of the atmosphere, that has environmental benefits, but it's also a technological fix and an economic development opportunity, and about energy security and many other dimensions to transition to solar.
Do you think that people are beginning to make that connection more and more now that development does correlate with environmental impact, this concept of climate smart development?
Yeah, I think that there's growing recognition that there's no, it's not either or, that we can advance development while addressing the climate crisis. And that in fact, if we don't address the climate crisis, and if that doesn't inform our program design and our strategy, then we're not going to be advancing a strategic program for development.
Mm. And so, can you walk us through what are some of the key objectives that you want to achieve over the next 8 years since you've laid out this policy?
Well, we have a goal to reduce carbon emissions by 6 billion tons. So that's about 1.5 times all emissions in the United States in 2021. So you have a sense of scale. much of that will be through what we call nature-based solutions. So we want to preserve 6 billion hectares of carbon critical landscape. Then we also want to increase the adaptation and resilience of 500 million people around the world, with a focus on early warning systems regarding weather patterns, both to save lives and livelihoods and to help agriculturalists, which are so dominant in many countries where we work, to better adapt their planting and harvesting seasons to weather forecasting. And then we want to catalyze $150 billion in public and private finance, because there's a huge gap. We need 3 to 5 trillion a year in climate finance by 2030. So we have to get the private sector engaged. So it's also about using our capital in ways to set the stage for private sector investment. And overarchingly, there's a big emphasis on equity and supporting Indigenous people and local communities and women and youth and others that are critical to the solutions.
I mean, the private sector has been pretty excited about these topics. Sustainability has been like the buzzword, right, for the last 5 years or so, I can say from my perspective. Do you feel like they're really beginning to make progress beyond just simple carbon offset programs? Like, is there now nuance to this conversation? Because as we've seen in the media, there's good carbon offset programs and there's not so good carbon offset programs.
Well, I think environmental and social responsibility goes way beyond offsets. But when you're referring to offsets, you're referring to the carbon market. So the idea there is that you can purchase a ton of carbon emissions. So if you are trying to reach your own net zero goals for emissions, you can offset your own emissions by reducing emissions somewhere else or avoiding emissions somewhere else, although those avoided emissions are the most controversial offsets. I think, when you talk about social responsibility and environmental responsibility, you're thinking about a much broader range of issues, like the kinds of issues Global Witness thinks about. Making sure there's appropriate consultation. In many cases, free, prior, and informed consent is necessary before you build a new dam or start, harvesting minerals in a new mine. It's also about making sure that, there's no abuse of women surrounding a site, that there isn't trafficking of youth and forced labor going on, that you're not releasing mercury into the waterways. So it's a very kind of broad brushstroke of activities that would fall under that category. And, the offsets is kind of one component part.
Do you think that conversation is getting, richer and richer, though, as time is going by? Like, is the private sector really delving into all of these topics and keen to actually make impact? I mean, the concern has obviously been greenwashing. There's a lot of talk, but is there enough action?
Yeah. No, I think that it's a growing trend. I mean, what you see is that it used to be the sort of so-called ESG, environmental and social governance issues, were kind of relegated to the communications teams of especially big brands. And now it's kind of a C-suite concern where, like, the executives that are actually doing forecasting and thinking about the balance sheet and thinking about recruitment and retention are paying much more careful attention to this, and especially the brand sensitive companies that know that it can really hit their bottom line if they are caught up in behavior that's illegal or problematic on any other level. I think the privately held companies that may or may not have a forward facing brand, and smaller companies typically fly under the radar. So in places like that, you're really hoping for leadership that's genuinely committed to the issues.
I mean, as someone who's had this multiple decade career in this space, when you look back, I mean, do you sort of have advice for people that are listening, because many of them are young and starting out their careers, of the path to follow? I mean, did you really just follow issues that motivated you, or were you really thinking about, like, how to navigate the nonprofit space with some sort of strategy?
Well, I mean, I was fortunate in that I was able to opt to do work that I was passionate about throughout my entire life. And, I've done so many different things, including, a global undercover investigation on the Russian mafia and their involvement in trafficking women for forced prostitution. So if you look at my career, it would be like a zigzag rather than like a straight line to a clear destination. I've just tried to apply myself where I think I could be as useful as possible. I also had a strategy to make sure that while I got a law degree to try to have more influence on systems changing interventions and policy, I felt strongly that I needed exposure to actual service delivery on the ground. So that's why I worked in a women's shelter. That's why I represented disability applicants who were denied their benefits. That's why I clerked for a judge and was running the adoptions division and the abuse and neglect division and family court, so that I could be informed by those on the ground experiences in terms of how I thought about policy interventions and get a more macroscopic picture of the kinds of problems that we're confronting. I was also fortunate. I mean, I think a lot of students these days graduate with, enormous loans. I didn't, because my grandmother was able to underwrite my education. So I was able to build a resume early on by finding fellowships that would provide like relatively small stipends. That's not available to everybody. So I think for youth who have to earn a living right away, even as early as, when they're in college, it's a kind of a different situation. And the question is always, what can you do to build your resume, even as you're trying to earn the money you have to? And that's a pretty untenable situation for a lot of people. And I recognize that. And I think there's more and more emphasis on experience over education. I certainly pay much more attention to somebody's work experience than I do to their education. And I've certainly never asked for a transcript for people that are really stressing out about their GPA. I think that matters, when you're looking to graduate schools, but more generally, your experience and also your linguistic capacity. Like if you want to do global work, do you speak several languages? Do you have proficiency in them? And do you have that on the ground experience is really what will matter. And if you can afford to intern, for a stipend or even on a voluntary basis, that is one of the best ways to find your way into an organization, but it's not very equitable, which is why unpaid internships are increasingly frowned upon, at least in the United States and the progressive community, because it's not fair to advantage people who don't have to pay those loans by giving them access to an organization where they can really develop a reputation and get an opportunity for a job.
You've also done nonprofit and government. I mean, can you talk a little bit about the differences of working in those two spaces? Government kind of gets a bad rap for being very, slow moving and highly bureaucratic, but what's your experience been like?
Yeah, I mean, I think for a lot of people, their exposure to government is not very positive. So they're either looking at like the stalemate in Congress and the fact that we're possibly headed towards a shutdown of the entire federal government because they can't, come to agreement on the budget, or they're trying to get their license reviewed at the Department of Motor Vehicles and they've got some surly civil servant who isn't, very helpful. I mean, my experience in government has been incredibly positive. I'm surrounded by technical experts in all of these fields, whether it's education or agriculture or biodiversity. And, these are people with master's degrees, with PhDs, with, decades of experience in designing and delivering programs on the ground and like a very deep dedication. They're not sort of punching in at 9 and punching out at 5. They're, very hardworking and, it's been a great experience. There is, of course, a degree of bureaucracy in an organization as large as USAID or in any federal government bureaucracy. But, we also have a big burden busting initiative that Administrator Power has been yielding to try to reduce unnecessary burdens. I think the thing to remember is that, we're stewards of public resources. Our budget comes from the government. It's from Congress. So it's 30 to $50 billion a year, 50 including supplementals for like Ukraine interventions and food security. And those are public dollars, and Congress scrutinizes the expenditure of that money very carefully, and we're subject to audits and can face investigations if those funds are misappropriated or misused in any way. So there needs to be a degree of accountability, which kind of adds to the bureaucratic dimensions, and some of that's necessary.
Fair enough, fair enough. About 10, 15 years ago when I was in college, and I was actually in Washington, D.C. at Georgetown, I remember this dialogue of like, the nonprofit sector is not going to solve these problems. It's really the private sector that's going to come in, and this movement of social entrepreneurship that really took root of how, companies or that kind of approach of the private sector could be a part of the answer. We've seen that evolve now over the last 10 years. What has been your takeaway from years of working in this space? Is the answer really cooperation across all three sectors? Or do you feel like one sector does have, a larger role to play?
Well, I think all, civil society, governments, and the private sector all have very important roles to play. I think, one of the dangers for the kind of civil society is to take up responsibilities that should be fulfilled by the government, because it reduces pressure on government to fulfill its responsibilities. So, for example, when you have nonprofits dealing with homelessness, when, in my view, housing is a human right and should be addressed by the government, I think that can be problematic. The private sector, we have to stimulate private sector investment in adaptation and mitigation of the climate crisis, because there's no way we're going to get to 3 to 5 trillion through public dollars alone. But at the same time, when you privatize sectors that have historically been run by the government, for example, privatizing prisons in the United States, that's a problem, because what happens is then you have the prison guards and the sort of the for-profit entity investing money in politicians and in the judiciary, which ultimately leads to mandatory minimum sentences, which fills the jails, which increases their profits. So, likewise, education, there's a big focus on, charter schools and, other opportunities in education, but I think we should focus on making the public schools stronger and more innovative. So I think it's not either or. I think we need to figure out how three sectors of society work together. But I mean, every government has a different constitution and a different set of views about what responsibility government has for individuals, with like the Nordic countries taking much more responsibility for their citizens in terms of healthcare and housing and education than the United States does, for example.
How does that play out for climate? I mean, do you feel then there needs to be more regulation for certain things that would, prevent externalities that are damaging to the environment?
Well, we need a price on carbon. I mean, that's our biggest problem, right? You can just, the externality is the pollution in this context, right? So you can pollute as much as you want in most countries around the world with no penalty. And, it's people who are breathing in that soot, or, the atmosphere itself, which is warming, and all of the associated costs that are borne by individuals in the private sector and in government. So if we don't start, valuing what's valuable and taxing what's toxic, we're not going to get where we need to go, both with respect to the climate and, any other kind of behaviors we're trying to tackle.
Mm. I just want to say to the audience at this time, we're about 30 minutes in. If anybody has any questions, they can pop them into the Q&A, and I would be happy to ask questions from the audience as well. What question for you, Gillian? Like today, there's so much discussion about the environment. I mean, it's really the hot button topic that excites everybody from Gen Z onwards. And so what really do you look at as sort of like the core pillars that you would love to target? I mean, if there were one or two issues within the environmental debate that you could really focus all your energy on, are there a couple that come to top of mind?
Well, again, I'm just like, I'm never that comfortable with the boxes. I mean, obviously, I'm choosing to focus on the climate crisis specifically, which is a very, broad umbrella, right? Because you can't tackle the climate crisis without understanding that changes in climate are creating a biodiversity crisis, which is in turn affecting pollinators, which is affecting food security. I mean, everything is so interconnected. Plastic is another issue that's part of my portfolio. I mean, plastic is a petroleum-based product. It's clogging up, the oceans. At some point in the not so distant future, there's going to be more plastic than there are fish in the ocean. So it's not just the production of plastic that's a problem, it's the waste and disposal. So I think the climate crisis is the most significant threat confronting life on Earth today, and I think everybody should be doing something about it. So that's my answer to your question. But there's so many ways in which you can intersect with that crisis. You can look at agriculture and deforestation, or you can look at plastics, or you can look at renewable energy, or you can look at biofuels. I mean, there's so much room for engagement there.
I agree. I don't want to put you on the spot, but I mean, as a journalist, also, I've seen like this, the headlines can get really heavy after a while because you just see about problem after problem after problem in the world, especially when it comes to environment, right? Are there examples that you can think of through your work where you've been able to bring about a solution and it's created a positive impact? I mean, to maybe just share with the audience of, the power of the work that you do, and solutions do exist out there.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's why I do what I do, because it is depressing to read the headlines and to feel like you're not doing anything about the problem. And of course, the news that sells is like the news of death and destruction. It's never like good news that anybody seems to want to read, apparently. So that's pretty frustrating. But I mean, we're doing work all over the world that's like having a real difference. We're helping, electrify rural Africa with solar energy. We're helping governments in India procure renewable energy at affordable and consistent prices. We're helping smallholder farmers get insurance that will help them navigate, like the fifth season of drought, so that they can actually continue to feed their families. We're identifying indigenous crops and seeds that are more drought tolerant. We're helping waste pickers in Asian countries that are responsible for 40% of global mismanaged plastic waste to develop livelihoods, collecting and kind of managing those waste facilities, and partnering with companies to actually build recycling capability while educating communities not to use so much plastic in the first place. So yeah, there's definitely positive impacts all the time, and we're not moving far enough, fast enough, and the news isn't good.
Well, that's what I was going to ask you next is, I mean, what do you see as the challenge for your work? Is it lack of funding? Is it, not enough communication, perhaps, of all these incredible things that you're doing? What are some of the challenges that you see?
Well, I mean, like I said, we need to put a price on carbon. There's politics in many places, including the United States, that make that next to impossible at the moment. But that would make a huge difference. I mean, instead of putting a price on carbon, we're actually investing $7 trillion in 2022 in fossil fuel subsidies to underwrite some of the wealthiest industries in the world. So it definitely makes literally no sense. We need governments to be thinking more creatively about, what we call concessional capital. So what they can do to de-risk like private sector investments in adaptation to support people to adapt to higher temperatures or rising sea levels or many of the other changes we have associated with the climate crisis.
Can you break that down a little bit? Because I mean, I know what you're talking about, but there's a fair amount of jargon there. What does that mean, like adaptation strategies for those who may not know?
Well, so I was talking about adaptation earlier. So, what 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 crops will actually grow in the place where you live, where rainfall is going to increase dramatically or decrease dramatically, depending on what we can understand from satellite data. How can you grow your crops, diversifying your crops so that you don't have so much dependent on so many, and taking new approaches to irrigation. How can health clinics respond to extreme heat? I mean, there are places that are topping out at 160 degrees Fahrenheit. It's actually impossible for humans to survive at temperatures that high. And sometimes migration is actually an appropriate adaptive response to the crisis that we're seeing. How are we going to navigate people who are displaced either by extreme heat or economic peril or rising sea levels, where entire islands actually go underwater? I had a meeting yesterday with all the heads of state from the Pacific Islands and our senior envoy for climate, John Kerry. And, people are talking about digital systems of governance and how they're going to preserve their culture when their islands disappear, low-lying islands in the Pacific. So adaptation means so many things. How do you actually survive in a very different environment? How do you continue to, thrive economically? Also, what adjustments might you need to make to building construction to adapt to, like predicted extreme weather events?
I think that's also important. I remember writing a story several years ago about, roofs in India, and they were trying to experiment with different materials to keep them cool because people were heating up, especially in lower income neighborhoods. And it was just an unsexy topic, but we've got to talk about these things. I mean, these are really sometimes not the stories that editors want to put on front pages, but it's so important what you're talking about. I mean, some final thoughts, perhaps, if you would have, is that so if somebody decides today they want to get a green job, really, like that's the term, being used for the green economy, are there certain avenues that you would say explore beyond what you said earlier of like, just exploring what you're passionate about and you're taking an internship and things like that? Are there certain avenues that you feel like really are going to be careers of the future?
Well, I mean, renewable energy is like growing by leaps and bounds, notwithstanding the ongoing subsidies to fossil fuels. I mean, the price has been dropping. Part of that has to do with slave labor in China's supply chain, but that's another topic. I think there's definitely room for engagement in renewable technologies and in technology-based responses to the climate crisis more broadly. And they're really encouraging more and more women to get involved as engineers and in construction in those sectors. So if that's an area of interest, I think it's an important one. I think there's not enough attention being paid to urban adaptation. Like more than 50% of the world's population is going to be living in cities very soon, and development aid has typically focused in rural areas and agricultural livelihoods, but how are these cities going to adapt? So thinking about urban planning and, how to support cities to increase both the economic opportunity and their resilience to climate crisis is another really interesting area for focus.
Absolutely. Absolutely. We have a couple questions. One is from Ezra. Would you suggest some innovative ideas for environmental health development? You may have said some already in our discussion, but any particular innovative ideas you've seen that have to do with health specifically?
Well, so we have a project called Clean Air Catalyst, which is focused on, we have pilot cities in Kenya, Indonesia, and India. And the focus there is on pinpointing the primary sources of pollution and developing responses to address that pollution, which obviously has huge benefits in terms of human health because people are ingesting this pollution in these urban areas. So I was in Kenya recently for the Africa Climate Summit and had a chance to look at a mural which is actually painted to absorb toxins. You know, the paint itself is an innovation, but they were talking about the fact that one of the places they pinpointed for intervention is a hospital because basically people are ingesting incinerated hospital waste in Nairobi right now, which is pretty powerful if you think about it. So I think, you know, focuses on air quality are really important. I think we need lots of innovations in cooling because, as I said, you know, the temperatures are going to rise so substantially. And what we don't want is to put like a whole bunch more pressure on, you know, the energy system to increase our carbon pollution in response to the heat, which is caused by carbon pollution. So, you know, what are innovative approaches to heating? I think extreme heat's going to be a huge issue and another example of place to focus energy.
Yeah, we don't need more ACs in the world, right? Another question is from Mohammed, who says, in terms of adaptation and mitigation, is there any way to focus on important issues? Given from his experience, Africa has faced trafficking, people, floods, lack of energy, and healthcare. To achieve these SDGs, we need to drive leaders to the poorest countries. I think he's getting at the root of the issue, which is just that when you don't have perhaps government leadership to take, you know, charge, what do you do in those scenarios? And that's a big question.
Yeah. I mean, a big kind of narrative coming out of the climate summit was, you know, focused on Africa as an opportunity for economic development and, you know, rather than focusing exclusively on the very significant reality that Africa is a victim of a crisis it didn't cause, right? And should be accessing funds through these new loss and damage funds. So I think we're seeing more political leadership recognizing that sustainable green growth is, you know, a future economic opportunity. And that's, you know, that's going to be really important, not just to say that, but to ensure there's economic opportunities for investment in green growth.
One more question from Gloria Francis. She works for a nonprofit that is working with women in Nigeria and West Africa on recycling. And she's saying that, you know, it's hard to perhaps get the funds and support that they need to carry out this work. Do you have any advice for nonprofits that are trying to get more support? Is there a way that they can get in touch with USAID?
Well, I think the best way to access USAID, if you're new to the agency, is to go to workwithusaid.org. That's a new website that we put up to help introduce people to the agency and demystify accessing kind of resources. And we also have a localization agenda, which is focused on increasing the support to locally based entities, because many of the big development agencies like USAID tend to invest in other big organizations because it's hard to manage a grant of that size. And like I said, you know, we're held to account for delivery and reporting is, you know, a challenge for any government grants. So anyway, we're trying to reduce the burdens and the barriers to entry, but that's the best place to go to learn more about the opportunity to partner with USAID, workwithusaid.org.
Well, I'm sorry, I know we have a couple more questions, but we've run out of time. So thank you so much for giving us, you know, an hour of your time this morning. I appreciate it. And I hope it was helpful to those listening and they got some nuggets that they can follow on their green journey. But thank you so much, Gillian, for your time. Appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you. Have a great day, everyone.
Thank you, everybody. I just wanted to quickly say thank you so much, Isha. That was awesome. I think we can stop the recording.